Welcome to this year's Steiner Lecture. The Andrew Steiner Visiting Scholar Fund was created by the family and friends of Mr. Steiner, an alumnus in the class of 1963 of St. John's College, Annapolis. It was established to attract scholars from different disciplines and worlds, recognizing Andrew's great intellectual versatility. Tonight, I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Professor Alexandra Horowitz as our Steiner Lecturer. Professor Horowitz is the Senior Research Fellow in the Dog Cognition Lab at Barnard College in New York. She received her bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania and her master's and doctorate in cognitive science from the University of California in San Diego. Dr. Horowitz's interest in dogs is deep and wide, as is shown by the breadth of her journal publication titles, which include What Smells? Gauging Attention to Olfaction and Canine Cognition Research, and Disambiguating the Guilty Look. Salient prompts to a familiar dog behavior, among many others. She hosts the podcast Off Leash on the Freakonomics Radio Network and is also the author of several books, including The Year of the Puppy, How Dogs Become Themselves, and Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know. I'm told that Mr. Steiner would have especially loved Dr. Horowitz's books as containing the perfect combination of science, curiosity, and love of dogs that he had himself. Though he eventually settled on bloodhounds, his household was filled with dogs of all sorts, including Jake, Lewis, Bones, and Ringo. Dr. Horowitz's lecture tonight is titled The Science and Nature of Dogs, from Umwelt to Pet. It will be followed by a question period shortly after the lecture in the conversation, which is right next door. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Horowitz to St. John's College.
Thank you so much. It is a tremendous honor to be here. I want to thank Susie Paulman for the invitation, and Heather Latham for managing all the logistics, and to the Steiner family, who I had the pleasure to spend some time with just now, for your bequest that brings me here, and for all of you for gathering here, whether you are required to or not. Today, I want to touch on both sides of my current interests regarding dogs. So that's canid perception and cognition on the one hand, and the status of dogs in contemporary society on the other. As a behavioral scientist, I'm principally concerned with empirical questions about my subjects. But as a human being who lives with dogs, the ramifications of the science on thinking about how we live with dogs and society's use and responsibilities towards dogs, or any animal, have just as much interest for me. In other words, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my field, which is dog cognition, and some of my research, including the guilty look, or my research approach, especially as regards an understanding of their umwelt, the worldview of an animal or individual. In other words, what is perceptible to them, what they understand, which also helps define what is meaningful to them in the world. So I will describe two studies from our lab that typify my approach, and then I also want to discuss what it means to be a dog, a pet, today, at least in Western society. I'm a scientist, and we communicate with each other via pictures or slides, for better or worse. So I've tried a variation on the theme of the scientist's PowerPoint, and have punctuated my slides with a few works of art. Dogs make appearances in a lot of art that are meaningful to me. That's a little bit about my umwelt. It's meaningful to me for their vision of a dog. So I want to use this Giacomo Balla piece to ask, who is the dog? The reminder that he provides is that we're fooled by the relative smoothness of our perception into thinking that this question is straightforward, that what we see is all there is. I want to unsee dogs. I want you to unsee dogs so that we can see them again anew. Thinking about dogs, starts with their origin story. Who they are is partly about where they're from, which we still haven't got straight. What we know is that the domestic dog, Canis familiaris, shares a common ancestor with the gray wolf, Canis lupus. These two present species are genetically quite similar, but both are descended from some ancient wolf. It's likely that a population of proto-dogs, ancient wolves, began to genetically diverge from other wolves before they became what we think of as dogs. That is, before they became in our thrall, used by us for their guarding or hunting or companionate skills, their breeding controlled by humans. And indeed, genetic evidence indicates that there were multiple domestication events in different parts of the world, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, at least 14 to 20,000 years ago. Wolf and dog genetic divergence isn't quite the same as the domestication story. Because this is prehistory, we don't have a definitive account of how it happened. There are suggestive artifacts and findings that support the genetic evidence for domestication, such as this discovered burial site in Israel of a Natufian woman with her arms around a puppy from 14,000 years ago. Some of the oldest art we have is from Saudi Arabia 8,000 years ago, showing dogs with leashes in a hunting group. Note they all have the curly tail, typical of early domesticated canids, but not of wolves. As to how we got to the point of hunting with or being buried with descendants of wolves, one narrative suggests that wolves self-domesticated by approaching human settlements where we had begun creating trash, throwing out the bits of food we could not digest outside of the settlement. We've long been a trash-generating species. These intrepid wolves exploited this new niche, became more scavengers than predators, and over time, humans accepted and then even encouraged these resident wolves, began using them functionally as guards or hunting companions or maybe even as food, and began eventually selecting them, breeding the ones we liked the best. As an aside, for anyone who has had the dog eat their homework, know that as long as 5,000 years ago, they were ruining our cuneiform tablets. Having trotted into human society, millennia passed without terrific scrutiny of the relationship, the human-dog relationship. Dogs only recently became a subject of science, that is, a science concerned with the dog qua dog. When I began researching dogs in my graduate cognitive science program in 1998, I had to argue the case for studying them. No one thought there was profit in asking questions of dog mind. I've reflected since on why dogs were not taken seriously cognitively. It may have been because in being domesticated, they were almost not considered pure animals. They were adulterated, as though they were a different class of creatures, pets, not wild animals, who could not tell us anything about cognition, could they? And surely we thought we already did know all about them too. They were living in our homes, sleeping alongside us in our beds even. Most of all, I think, the fact that they were not primates, not big-brained, explains their invisibility in the field. It was thought they were less likely to show cognition commensurate with ours. In all events, their absence from cognitive psychological research was, in retrospect, a sign of our biases as researchers in thinking about cognition, what it is, and who has it. I convinced my committee. 2 decades on, now the Dog Cognition Lab at Barnard runs studies with own dogs who come to our lab on campus or submit to our gaze in their homes or dog runs. Our subjects are allowed to not only opt out of a study, but opt in, co-participants with their people in our studies. And at the end, they select their own toy to take home and are conferred a bachelor's of dogness. Dogs were, of course, in science significantly in the 20th century. They were convenient research subjects, models of life forms who just happened to be dogs. They were tractable, friendly, easy to manipulate, flexible. The research was not studying dogs qua dogs, though. Most introductions to psychology mention Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. Here some of them are: Krasavitz, Beck, Milka, Ikar, Joy, Tungus, Arlekin, Russian, Toy, Marushka. Pavlov was measuring fistulated dog salivary response when presented with meat, when he happened upon what became known as the conditioned reflex, after he found dogs to be salivating not only to the meat, but to the site of the technician who brought it into them, where they were tethered. The form of learning called conditioning is a well-established psychological concept now, and is even associated with dogs, though all nervous systems that we know of learn in this way, including ours. That dogs were the subject here is to their deficit, I think, in that it has to some extent restricted the imagination about other ways in which dogs might learn. Dogs were in other influential studies as well, including the University of Pennsylvania researcher Martin Seligman's demonstration of the idea of learned helplessness. Dogs who were administered unavoidable shocks underfoot learned to just accept the shocks passively, later failing to make a move to accept them, even if escape were possible. The conditioned reflex, learned helplessness, these were the researchers' interest, not the mind of the dog demonstrating them. Since about the turn of our millennium, though, there's been an explosion of interest in dogs' behavior for their own sake, partly because of this kind of behavior. This is Carpaccio, St. Augustine in his study. I'm talking about the gaze of that little white dog, minding St. Augustine's every move. I think of them as anthropologists among us, observing us, noting our behavior, learning the difference between St. Augustine putting down his pen and looking out the window for inspiration or in anticipation of a walk outside. Some of the very early work in this field showed that dogs are impressively good at what we would call social cognitive tasks, seeming awareness of and understanding of not only other dogs, but an entirely other species, us. This is demonstrated in the lab and in homes by their sensitivity to communicative cues that we think are important. For instance, in various situations, in various studies, researchers have shown that dogs ably use our attention, distinguishing when it is at them or distracted or absent altogether to know when they can steal a forbidden treat. A lot of dog research involves treats. They follow our pointing of our arm or even finger to find the source of food, something even our non-human primate relatives, apes and bonobos, don't do reliably. And a few dogs, such as Chaser, went one further, learning to associate words with the names of a surprisingly large number of toys. For Chaser, it was 1,022, which she could retrieve, nose, and select on request. So a field of comparative inquiry was launched, asking whether dogs are as skilled at cognitive tasks as, say, a developing young person is. It has been fertile, but in my mind, it misses something: the dog. My research has instead been guided by two figures, the philosopher Thomas Nagel and the Austrian biologist Jakob von Uexküll. Nagel asked, what is it like to be another creature? And von Uexküll, perhaps inadvertently, provided what is to me the way to begin to answer that question. You might know Nagel's 1974 paper, What is it like to be a bat? Perhaps this unhappy-looking Dürer bat. The paper and the question was provocative not just for philosophers, but also for cognitive scientists who are interested in the nature of subjective experience. Nagel chose the bat, which he called fundamentally alien, because he felt sure that bats have experiences. They are not so far down the phylogenetic tree that we doubt that. But as animals who see through sonar, sending out high-frequency sounds, and just as quickly hearing how they've reflected off objects in the world to draw a picture of the environment around them, while on the wing, he felt that we cannot possibly know what it's like. I disagree. I think that with an understanding of an animal's sensory equipment, how they see the world, and an understanding of their cognitive abilities in that world, how they make meaning of the world, you begin to get at what it is like, as with another person. You are able to make an informed imaginative leap into their experience, at least. Jakob von Uexküll described this as an understanding of an animal's umwelt. That's a German word meaning environment that he appropriated to mean specifically their perceptual environment. An animal's umwelt is their subjective or self-world, defined by the sensory bubble which enables and circumscribes what they perceive, as well as the meaning or affordances of stimuli in that environment. For the bat, their umwelt is sonar defined. The world is visible when sound can move smoothly through the air, but the world is murky if another high-frequency sound complicates the signal that they are receiving. This dais has a meaning, a functional tone to us, but to the bat, it is but an obstacle. For dogs, their umwelt begins with their nose. Dogs are olfactory creatures. As we see the world, dogs smell it. It's worth it to linger for a moment on why I say they're olfactory creatures. I understand last week was also about smell, so bear with me. Anatomically, their specialization is clear. They have hundreds of millions more olfactory receptor cells, the cells that receive odorous molecules from the air and convert them to neural impulses to the brain than we do. This enables them to detect more smells, volatile organic compounds, and more types of smells at lower concentrations. In their noses, they have separate routes for smelling and breathing in order to ensure that airflow gets to the olfactory epithelium with every inhale. Apart from their snouts, they have an accessory olfactory organ, the vomeronasal organ, above the roof of their mouth, below their nasal septum, like a second nose, which detects non-volatile compounds like pheromones and other hormones, which all animals, including us, give off and which hold information about our health, emotions, and identity. Their brains are scaled to receive this wealth of information. The olfactory bulb is 2% of their brain. By comparison, the olfactory bulb is 1/30th of 1% of human brain volume. Their specialization continues with their methods. They even sniff more and better than we do. I want you to just think if you have sniffed anything today. I hazard that although you could tell me dozens, even hundreds of things that you saw, you may only have a list of 2 or 3 things you've smelled, most of which you ate. Dogs sniff 7 times a second on average. Even at twice a second, we hyperventilate. Also, when we exhale, out goes the scent. In fact, that's a good way to get the scent out of your nose. Dogs exhale out the side slits of their nose in order not to displace the odors coming in, enabling a kind of circular breathing that keeps the color-odor picture constant. Flow visualization models of the movement of air exhaled out the side slits calls them nostril air jets, which create turbulence that sends more odors into the nostril to be sniffed. Their nostrils move independently, grabbing a different smell image of the world, allowing a kind of stereo olfaction that tells them not only what an odor is, but where it's coming from. Their nostril use is lateralized. Sniffing something familiar or enjoyable, they sniff primarily with their left nostril. Examine your dog's behavior when you get home. When smelling something aversive, researchers use veterinarian sweat for this. They only sniff with their right nostril. That's the right brain being active. It's ipsilateral. And you can see, therefore, their brain activity in their nose. So to get at what it is like to be a dog, then, I have to study how they use their nose in their environment, essentially olfactory cognition, not visual cognition. And their environment is a natural environment around other dogs and people. I want to know what St. Augustine's little white dog smelled, not just saw. With a dog as my subject, though, I needed to take another step first. One that motivated the first study I'll tell you about. That step was spending time and effort unpacking the kinds of assumptions that we make about dogs' experiences all the time. We need only meet a dog to start making statements about what they want or need or feel. But if we want to effectively understand their umwelt, we have to suspend our reflexive anthropomorphisms of dogs. When I began studying them, I lived with a dog, and I noticed myself doing what most dog people do when asked about their dog and what their dog is thinking or feeling, verbalizing her experience, making essentially claims about her mental life based on extrapolations from my mental life. In particular, we dog people, tend to make attributions of emotions to dogs. He did it out of spite. He's vengeful. He knows he's guilty. She's just jealous. This is completely normal behavior, this anthropomorphizing. Something we have done for thousands of years. The archaeologist Stephen Mithin suggests that there is anthropomorphic thinking evident in Paleolithic art 40,000 years ago. We do it to predict and explain non-human phenomena, and that appears in language like talking about winds as angry, or the rock that wants to roll down the hill. What I realize is that with respect to dogs, these anthropomorphisms, these claims made about their emotions, are testable, and if found to be faulty, replaceable with that which the dog might actually be experiencing. One study I did empirically testing anthropomorphisms was this examination, as Susie mentioned, of what's called the guilty look in dogs. 74% of owners feel that their dog definitely feels guilty when they've done something wrong. Wrong. What a human says is wrong. Darwin was among those owners. There can, I think, be no doubt that a dog feels shame, he wrote. The guilty look has characteristic features. You might recognize a few. Averted gaze, quickly turning the head, breaking eye contact. Rolling over to show the stomach. Raising a paw. That shaking behavior they do, that's part of the guilty look. Dropping the tail, a low wag between the legs. Leaving altogether. The ears or head down against the head. And tongue flicking. A little bit of averted gaze and maybe ears down are on display, for instance, on Barney. Barney was a guard dog in the UK who was perhaps unwisely put in charge of Elvis's invaluable collection of teddy bears overnight. In the morning, they discovered this scene: bears tossed asunder, limbs pulled off, stuffing unstuffed. Elvis's favorite teddy bear named Mabel was destroyed. He got off easy. He looked remorseful, they said. Is he, though? Does Barney or any dog appreciate the weight, the rightness or wrongness of their actions and display that understanding after a misdeed? I contest that. I recruited dog people and I went to their homes. I asked owners to show the dog a treat, set it down on the floor, and then ask their dogs not to eat it. The owners then left the room, and I looked at what the dogs did when they returned. There were 4 conditions. It was a simple 2x2 design. There are 2 things the dog could do. The dog ate the treat or not, in which case the dog was disobedient by our rules. When the owner was called back into the room, I reported what had happened, and they either greeted the dog or scolded their dog. So, usually, the appropriate happened. When the dog was obedient, they were greeted by their person. I asked them to do so, as though they had just reunited with their dog after being long lost in the other room. But if they ate the treat, I told the owner and I asked them to scold them as they usually did. That was usually issuing a mild reprimand. Sometimes, though, in the tradition of psychological experimentation everywhere, of slightly misleading people as to the true variable in the study, I misled the owner. When the dog was obedient, I told the owner that they had, in fact, eaten the treat, and thus they scolded their dog. Similarly, when disobedient, they were greeted as though they had not been. In all cases, I looked at the amount of guilty look that the dog showed. Here is, as they say, a recreation of the scene. Gidget's okay. What we found is that the dog's guilt, whether or not they'd eaten a forbidden treat, did not change the rate of guilty look they showed. But one variable did, and it was owner behavior. They showed more guilty look when they were scolded, regardless of their own behavior, or even about to be scolded, than when the owner greeted them. And in fact, interestingly, the dogs looked the most guilty when they weren't guilty, but they were scolded. The conclusion I'd make here is that the guilty look is an appeasement behavior designed to avoid punishment. It's a response to us, not an expression of their internal state necessarily. This is not to say, and I am not saying, that dogs do not or cannot feel guilt. As a scientist, I'm agnostic about that for now. But it is to say that what we read into their behavior deserves closer examination. Okay, then, now that we're questioning our reflexive assumptions about what the dog experiences, the complementary question is how to discover more about what they are actually experiencing. My second study is inspired by this William Wegman photo of his dog Man Ray, examining a bust of Man Ray. What is he experiencing here? Does a dog have self-awareness, a sense of self? Are they actors cognizant of their acting? There is a method that was developed to try to determine if an animal has a sense of self. It's called a mirror self-recognition test, the mirror mark test. Just as we recognize that the image in the mirror as we face it is our own, the question posed to individual animals of various species has been, do they recognize that it is themselves in a mirror and move to investigate an unexpected mark on their body, as we might, looking in the mirror, remove spinach from between our teeth? The primatologist Gordon Gallup, the designer of the study, after himself gazing at the reflection of himself in the mirror, first tested the design with chimpanzees. When surreptitiously marked with red dye on their foreheads, then exposed to a mirror, he found that upon seeing their reflection, they did not touch the mirror. They moved to touch and investigate the mark. They passed the test. Dolphins have passed. One elephant, Happy, has passed. Magpies have passed. Cichlid fish have passed. Dogs do not pass. They may bark at the mirror. They may look behind the mirror for the dog there. They may ignore the mirror. Does this mean they have no sense of self? I think you likely realize by now that I've been leading the witness. You are the witness. This is a visual experiment designed for visual creatures who care about how they look in a mirror how they look at all. Unlike any dog I have known who happily rolls in whatever that is in the grass. So I attempted to revise the design for their perceptual world, creating a kind of olfactory mirror to ask whether they recognize their smell reflection, as it were, and notice if it's changed. I did not, alas, create an actual mirror that radiates your odor back at you, much as that appeals to me. Following my graduate school dog behavior mentor, Dr. Mark Beckhoff, who noticed that dogs are more likely to investigate the yellow snow left by another dog in the snow around his home in Boulder, Colorado, than their own markings, I presented dogs with their own odor. These were their own odor, the odor of another dog, to see if I could reproduce in the lab what Beckhoff saw outside, and their own odor altered, marked, as it were, as the red dye on the chimpanzee's head. I also presented them with the marking odor. In this case, it was anise, the licorice smell, which dogs can detect, but which is not a savory odor for them. By itself, I presented that to control for the fact that dogs are neophilic, they like new things, to try to eliminate the possibility that if they had an interest in the marked smell of their own odor, it wasn't just an interest in the mark. A typical gauge of interest in studies with nonverbal subjects is duration of looking, or in this case, sniffing, investigating with the nose. So that's what we looked for. I want to give you a sense of what subject behavior looks like here. This is a mashup of a few subjects after a presentation of a trio of canisters by, each one holds an odor, by Julie Hecht, my lab manager at the time. Shake it off. We always have an outlier. This is the outlier. I actually speed up the video here a little bit. I study dogs. What we found first was that they were more interested in others' smell than their own, showing that even in canisters outside of context, they're distinguishing the odors of self and other. And crucially, they sniffed their own odor significantly longer when it was marked, even more than the mark itself, which wasn't as interesting to them. I think their behavior might indicate that they recognized their odor as themselves and showed interest in it only when their smell image had changed, suggestive evidence of a sense of self. So, in what would be a surprising turn of events to my younger self, these are the two primary arms of my work: olfactory cognition and anthropomorphizing. To then change tacks a little bit for the rest of my time with you. The result of doing work with a species so ubiquitous, with whom I engage on a daily basis, was to change how I view them in my life. Mindful of their smelly umwelt, I allow them untrammeled time sniffing. Sensitive to our tendency to assume that they are like us, I try not to assume that they'll enjoy being dressed as little devils, however becoming the costume. And it's to reflect on their position in our society. Should society reflect science? While science has now demonstrated that there is something that it is like to be a dog, and while we continue to draw a picture of what that is, the law and the policies around living with dogs have not changed much. The essayist Elaine Scarry has written that science's attempt to confer greater clarity on that which is already clear. That these and many animals are sentient is clear. That they feel things, want things, have friendships, plan, hope, that they have experiences. But this leads us into a host of new frontier questions, seeking greater clarity. Given that we affect them greatly, what is our obligation to them? How should we treat them? Should we use them? Though 95% of owners polled consider dogs a member of the family, they share our beds, they go on vacation with us, we celebrate their birthdays. To the law, a dog is property, chattel, an owned or ownable object, equivalent in status to a chair. To say that you own your chair is to say that you have absolute rights to do with your chair what you'd like. You have rights to sit on it, invert it, reupholster it, store it in your basement, or toss it out. The chair has no say in it. The same is more or less true in the law of your dog as your chair. Though dogs feel, love, suffer when abandoned, enjoy rolling around in fallen leaves, and presumably want not to be sat on, they have precisely no rights in the matter. There are some constraints on our behavior with our pups. Animal cruelty law forbids injuring animals, but only willfully, and forbids throwing them away. But if we throw them into an animal rescue organization's hands, that's fine. If we think for a moment about the repercussions for dogs, to the law, in the case of a divorce in a family, dogs are considered simply assignable property. They are distributed to one or the other party like silverware or a chair. I'll quote a judge in re the disposition of a dog named Tiny Tim before him. The analysis is no different than it would be if we were talking about a bicycle. Because they are property, they can be used in research. This was one of Pavlov's dogs, who is now stuffed and in the Museum of Hygiene in Russia after being experimented on for years without anesthetics. That was early 20th century. In the 19th century, vivisection was common in medical theaters. After Descartes, describing animals as mere automata, machines, their cries a mechanical response, not a reflection of their internal state. Dogs and other animals, too, were in a paradoxical suspension so close to being human that to see their innards was revealing, but distant enough to being human that it was not seen as cruel. In the 21st century, 65,000 dogs were used in biomedical research in the US last year. And that's only in experiments, teaching, research, surgery, or tests considered to have sufficient accompanying pain or distress that they need to be reported on. Because they are property, they can be currency. Anyone can be a breeder and sell dogs for money. Most breeders in the US are small enough that they do not qualify to have to meet federal standards for animal welfare care. The scale of the dog sale market is astonishing, with at least 10,000 breeders in the US, nearly as many as there are McDonald's restaurants, producing an estimated 2 million dogs a year. And as currency, they can be collateral for a loan and seized for lack of payment, as happened with this pug, Edda, seized by German officials for non-payment of taxes by her owners, and sold on eBay. Although most dogs, if you adopted your dog, has a replacement value of nothing. We can make more of them at our whim. The ease with which we can acquire dogs, you could buy a dog online before the end of my talk, is a major problem for their welfare as it feeds into irresponsible ownership, treatment, and often relinquishment. We not only make those 2 million dogs annually through breeding, But more recently, dogs are being made through cloning. Barbara Streisand is the person perhaps best known for publicly revealing that she cloned her beloved Coton de Toulouse Samantha, whose grave in this image is gazed upon by two of her replicates. This is now a retail business, a complex one, not only for the ponderous question it raises about identity, but in its technicalities. It is a kind of dog farming, as other dogs are required to achieve cloning. Dogs to be egg donors, to be surrogate mothers. There are strata of dogs in the system, dogs who are being cloned and dogs who are used to clone them. Another result of their property status is that, like the chair, we can alter them in various ways. We can de-sex, spay and neuter them, of course, and this is moreover seen as the responsible choice to address our contemporary society's issue of overpopulation of dogs. Notably, that is our fault, not theirs, but they are operated on for our sins. We can also alter them physically by cutting their ears and tail for appearance's sake, as is done with many breeds like Dobermans, to meet the breed standard. And we have, over generations, altered them via inbreeding to produce dogs with hypertrophied looks. On the right are examples of the evolution of the pug and the Afghan hound over 100 years. Those dogs on the far right are champion dogs. The flat-faced dogs, brachycephalic dogs, bred to have faces more like humans, with the eyes closer to the front of the face. These dogs in particular have been anatomically altered to the point where they are predisposed to problems smelling at all and to respiratory distress as they can't get air to their lungs through their deformed faces. And we can get rid of them at our pleasure. There is no punishment for outright abandoning a dog as long as it's into the arms of another. If we're allergic, if the apartment we're moving to won't allow it, or if we just grew tired of them, our moral and legal code says that we can give them up. In the not too distant past, vacation euthanasia, which is just what it sounds like, was not uncommon. Convenience euthanasia is now also practiced, where the convenience is ours. This extends to the right to euthanize your dog to have them buried with you, as happened to this Shih Tzu. Given what my field, the field of dog cognition, is discovering, the natural next step as scientists existing in a world of dogs is to ask how what we're learning about their minds will translate into changes in how we treat them, how we live with dogs, how we use them, and two, how this might resonate into how we treat the many non-dog animals around us. Culturally, we're afflicted by a kind of affective schizophrenia, to quote philosopher Deborah Slicer. We spend billions of dollars a year on very specific pets and accoutrements for said pets, while also spending more money than any other country on research using animals, including pet animals. Understanding the umwelt of these others, acknowledging their umwelt, shines a light on sentient lives interwoven with our own. Understanding how and why we circumscribe the communities of animals to whom we give moral consideration is our mandate. So I end with, as a researcher, pleasure to be living in this time when our collective gaze has turned toward dogs, and hope that our discoveries might have practical effect on their lives. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Finnegan, who I was lucky enough to share my life with for 14 years. Thank you.